Do you know there is a village in Nigeria where women run mad? Immediately they cheats on their husband. In the land of Nsukka, Nigeria, there is a powerful custom that strikes women with madness. Immediately they cheats on their husband. The only condition to regain their sanity back is when the husband forgives them and perform a special ritual for satisfaction. No one dares to break the rule. But what if someone breaks it to save the life of their loved ones? This is the true life story of Rose, who sacrificed her sanity for the sake of her husband's health. But you will never believe what happened. Rose and Mark were happily married for 5 years. They were so in love that people often said, "Look at Rose and Mark. That's what true love looks like." They had a little daughter named Mercy, who was the joy of their lives. Their small family was full of laughter and happiness, and their home was always warm with love. But one day, everything changed. Mark started feeling very tired all the time. At first, they thought it was just stress, but he kept getting weaker. Rose begged him to see a doctor, and after many tests, the doctor gave them terrible news. Mark had kidney failure. Mark's health got worse every day. Rose did everything she could to help him. She sold her jewelry, their car, and even some land. Friends and family helped too, but it wasn't enough. 8 months later, the doctor said, "Mark needs a kidney transplant soon, or he won't survive. The surgery will cost 10 million naira. 10 million. It was such a huge amount that Rose felt dizzy just hearing it. She sat by Mark's hospital bed, holding his hand as tears streamed down her face. "What will I do? I can't lose him," she whispered to herself. Rose thought about everyone she could ask for help. She went to her best friend Lucy, who had always been there for her. Lucy introduced Rose to a very wealthy man who had the means to help her with the money for Mark's surgery. However, his help came at a price. He wanted just one thing in return: to sleep with Rose. One bright Sunday morning, Rose stood alone in the hospital hallway. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing with thoughts of her husband, Mark, lying helpless in his hospital bed. How could she save him? What more could she do? Her best friend, Lucy, walked in briskly. She had a determined look on her face, her high heels clicking loudly on the floor. Lucy's voice broke through Rose's thoughts. "Rose, are you still standing here thinking about this? There's no time to waste. You have to decide now." Rose turned to Lucy, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. "Lucy, you don't understand," she said in a trembling voice. "My husband is from Nsukka. You know the tradition. If I sleep with another man, I'll lose my mind. I'll go mad, Lucy. What would happen to my daughter then? How would Mercy cope without her mother?" Lucy sighed deeply and placed her hand on Rose's shoulder. "Rose, listen to me," she said softly. "Yes, I know what the tradition says, but I also know this. Mark loves you. He's the only one who can save you by performing the sacrifice to appease the gods. Once he's better, we'll tell him the truth, that you did it to save his life. He'll understand. He'll forgive you, and he'll do the sacrifice. You'll all be fine. You'll live happily again." Tears streamed down Rose's face as she shook her head. "But what if he doesn't survive the surgery, Lucy? What if something happens to him? Who will take care of Mercy then? And even if I go through with it, who will look after Mercy until Mark recovers?" Lucy's voice softened even more, her eyes full of kindness. "Rose, don't worry about that. I'm your best friend. I'll take care of Mercy. I'll even look after Mark until he's back on his feet. I'll make sure everything is okay. Rose, you love your husband. You have to do this for him. Sleep with Chief, get the money, and save his life." Rose felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. The weight of Lucy's words crushed her. Her whole world seemed to spin out of control. How could she even think of doing such a thing? How could she face herself afterward? Just as the two friends stood in the hallway, the doctor walked past. His white coat billowed slightly as he hurried by, but when he saw Rose, he stopped. "Mrs. Rose," he called. "Please see me in my office." Rose wiped her tears quickly and followed him, her legs feeling heavy like lead. She entered the small office, where the doctor sat behind a cluttered desk. He removed his glasses and looked at her with concern. "Mrs. Rose," he began gently, "have you been able to raise the money for your husband's surgery?" Rose shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, sir. I'm still trying." The doctor sighed, leaning forward. "Please hurry, Mrs. Rose. Your husband's condition is getting worse every day. If we don't do the surgery soon, well, anything can happen." Those last words hit Rose like a thunderbolt. She stood up suddenly, unable to hold back her tears any longer. "Thank you, doctor," she mumbled before rushing out of the office. That night at exactly 3 a.m., Rose sat up in bed. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Her chest felt heavy as tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. She held her pillow close, sobbing into it, her heart breaking with every thought. "I don't want anything to happen to Mark," she whispered to herself. "We've been through so much together." The memories began to flood her mind. She remembered the day she met Mark, how kind he was to her from the very beginning. He had always been patient, loving, and supportive, even when things got tough. She thought about the time he stayed up all night to care for her when she fell ill, the way he always made her laugh, and how he made her feel like the most important person in the world. Her voice trembled as she spoke into the darkness. "If the tables were turned and I was the one lying in that hospital bed, Mark would have done anything to save me. I know he would." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "He has shown me nothing but unconditional love all these years. I have to save him, no matter what." With a sudden burst of determination, Rose grabbed her phone from the bedside table and dialed Lucy's number. It rang twice before Lucy answered, her voice groggy with sleep. "Rose, what's wrong?" Lucy asked. "Lucy, I've made up my mind," Rose said, her voice steady but full of pain. "I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes to save Mark." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lucy replied softly, "You're making the right choice, Rose. Everything will be okay." The next morning, Rose rushed to the hospital. She pushed open the door to Mark's room, her heart sinking at the sight of him. Rose sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Mark," she began, her voice breaking, "I know you can't hear me right now, but I need you to know something. I love you. You were my first, my only. You took my virginity, and I've never been with anyone else. But today, I'm about to do the one thing you hate the most, just to save you." Her tears fell onto his hand as she gripped it tightly. "I can't lose you, Mark. I love you so much," she whispered. With one final look at her husband, Rose stood up and walked out of the hospital room. Her steps were quick, but her heart felt heavy. She called Lucy, and together they drove to Chief's house. That night, Rose sat in Chief's lavish living room, her hands trembling as she waited. The room felt suffocating, and every second dragged on like an eternity. When Chief entered, he smiled smugly, his eyes filled with greed. Rose felt her stomach churn, but she reminded herself of Mark, lying helpless in that hospital bed. It was the longest and most painful night of her life. When it was over, Rose felt hollow, but she kept repeating to herself, "I did it for Mark. I did it to save him." The next morning, Chief transferred the money to Rose's account, just as he had promised. She didn't even wait to thank him. She left his house immediately and rushed to the hospital. At the hospital, Rose met with the billing office and paid off all the medical expenses. "Please, go ahead with the surgery," she told the staff, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. After ensuring everything was in place for Mark's operation, Rose left the hospital. Her body felt weak, and her emotions were in turmoil, but she had no time to break down. She headed straight home, where Lucy and her daughter Mercy were waiting. At home, Rose sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the walls, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. She called Lucy into her room, her hands trembling as she held them tightly together. "Lucy," Rose began, her voice cracking, "anything can happen to me starting tomorrow. Please take care of my daughter and my husband during this time." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she continued. "I also want you to lock me in the guest room. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, Promise me you won't let me out of the room or even out of this compound." Lucy's eyes filled with tears as she quickly pulled Rose into a tight embrace. "Rose," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have been my best friend for years. I'm like the sister you never had, and you're the same to me. I promise you I'll take care of Mercy and Mark. You've done the bravest thing for your family, and I'll stand by you no matter what." They held each other, crying silently, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Suddenly, the door creaked open and little Mercy waddled in, clutching her stuffed bunny. At just 2 years old, she didn't understand what was happening, but sensed the sadness in the room. "Mama!" she called out in her tiny voice, her big eyes looking worried. Rose knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly, her sobs growing louder. She kissed Mercy's hair, whispering, "I love you so much, my little princess. Always remember that." Mercy giggled softly, oblivious to her mother's pain. Rose's heart broke even more as she held her baby girl, wishing she could shield her from the storm that was about to come. That night, after putting Mercy to bed, Rose walked into the guest room. She stood in the middle of the quiet space, her thoughts racing. She locked the door from the inside, her hands shaking. Leaning against the wall, she whispered a prayer, tears streaming down her face. The hours passed slowly, and the silence felt deafening. Every sound outside the window made her heart leap, but nothing happened that night. The next morning, Lucy came to check on her, leaving food outside the door. "Rose?" she called gently. "I'm fine," Rose replied weakly from inside, though her voice was heavy with dread. Lucy kept her promise, taking care of Mercy and checking in at the hospital every day. The surgery had been scheduled for 5 days later, and the doctors were preparing Mark for the procedure. Rose stayed locked in the guest room, counting the days, each one filled with growing anxiety. But on the 3rd day, something changed. Lucy heard strange noises coming from the room. She rushed to the door and knocked urgently. "Rose, are you okay?" There was no response at first. Then Rose's voice came, but it sounded strange, disjointed. "Lucy, Lucy, why are the walls laughing at me? They won't stop laughing." Lucy's heart sank. She knew what was happening. "Rose, just stay calm. I'm right here," she said, fighting back tears. Inside the room, Rose started tearing at her clothes, mumbling incoherent words. Her cries turned to laughter, then back to sobs. By evening, Rose had completely lost touch with reality. She banged on the door, yelling for it to be opened, then sat on the floor, muttering nonsense to herself. Lucy sat outside the room, tears streaming down her face. She felt helpless, but knew she had to stay strong for her best friend. "Hang in there, Rose," Lucy whispered through the door. "Just a little longer. Mark's surgery is almost here. We'll fix this, I promise." The morning of the surgery was filled with tension and hope. Lucy woke up early. She quietly prepared Mercy for school. After dropping Mercy at school, Lucy rushed to the hospital. She couldn't sit still in the waiting area, so she paced up and down the hallway outside the operating theater. The surgery seemed to take forever, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. Her hands were clasped tightly as she whispered prayers under her breath, hoping against hope for good news. Finally, the door to the theater swung open, and the doctor stepped out, his face calm and composed. Lucy ran up to him, her heart pounding. "How is he, doctor?" she asked anxiously. The doctor smiled gently. "Congratulations. The surgery was successful. Mark is stable now, but he'll need a few days to regain consciousness and recover fully." Tears of relief streamed down Lucy's face. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much," she said, her voice shaking. Days later, Mark slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the light in the hospital room. His vision was blurry, but he immediately recognized Mercy's tiny figure sitting by his bedside. "Daddy!" Mercy exclaimed, wrapping her little arms around him. Tears welled in his eyes as he hugged her back. His voice was weak, but he managed to ask, Where's Rose?" Lucy, standing nearby, quickly stepped in. "Don't worry about Rose, she's fine, she'll come soon," she said, forcing a smile. Mark seemed confused but was too weak to press further. That evening, after the nurses had checked on him, Mark asked Lucy again, "Why hasn't Rose visited me yet? Is something wrong?" Lucy hesitated, her heart racing. She sat down beside him and held his hand. "Rose is out of town, Mark. She'll be back soon. I promise I'll explain everything when you're stronger, but for now, please focus on getting better." Though uneasy, Mark nodded, trusting Lucy's words. "All right, but tell her I miss her," he whispered before drifting off to sleep. Meanwhile, at home, the atmosphere was tense. Lucy sat in her room, exhausted and emotionally drained. Suddenly, she heard loud shouts coming from the guest room. "I am a fine girl. I am a fine Rose." Rose's voice echoed through the house as she banged on the walls and threw objects around the room. Lucy buried her face in her hands, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. "What am I going to do with this mad woman?" she muttered to herself. Finally, Lucy stood up and marched to the guest room. "Rose! Hey, fine woman!" she called out, her voice filled with forced cheer. "Come out. Let's go for a ride, okay?" Rose stopped shouting and looked at Lucy with wide, childlike eyes. "A ride? I like rides," she said, clapping her hands like a child. Lucy took Rose by the hand, her grip firm but gentle. "Yes, a ride. Let's go," she said, guiding her out of the room. Once they reached the car, Lucy opened the door and helped Rose inside. Rose hummed happily to herself, completely unaware of Lucy's troubled expression. Lucy drove for what felt like hours, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road became quieter and lonelier as they went further out of town. Rose sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, occasionally laughing at nothing in particular. When Lucy reached a deserted stretch of road, she stopped the car abruptly. She got out, walked around to Rose's side, and opened the door. "Rose, get out," Lucy said firmly. Rose looked at her, smiling. "Just get out, Rose!" Lucy snapped, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. She pulled Rose out of the car and gently pushed her toward the side of the road. Rose stumbled, her laughter turning into soft, incoherent murmurs. Lucy stood there for a moment. "I'm sorry, Rose," she whispered. Then, without looking back, she got into the car and drove away, leaving Rose alone on the lonely road. Days later, Mark was finally discharged from the hospital. Lucy arrived early to take him home. As they walked out of the hospital, Mark felt weak but relieved to be alive. Mercy ran up to him as soon as they arrived home, hugging him tightly. "Daddy, I missed you so much," she said, her little face lighting up with joy. Mark smiled, though his heart was heavy. Lucy had gone all out to make the homecoming special. The living room was decorated with colorful balloons, and a warm meal sat waiting on the table. "Welcome home, Mark," Lucy said cheerfully, trying to keep the mood light. Mark thanked her and looked around. Everything seemed perfect, but something was missing. His wife, Rose. That evening, after Mercy had gone to bed, Mark sat in the living room, staring into space. The thought of Rose not being there gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Gathering his strength, he walked to Lucy's room and knocked on the door. Lucy opened it, surprised to see him. "Mark, you should be resting," she said, but he stepped inside and sat down heavily on the chair. "Lucy," he began, his voice trembling, "where did you say Rose went? Please, I need to know everything that happened while I was unconscious. I can't stop thinking about her. Why hasn't she come back?" Lucy hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she pretended to straighten the edge of her bedsheet. Finally, she sat down beside him and spoke softly. "Mark, I didn't want to tell you this because I didn't want to hurt you, but you deserve to know the truth." Mark leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What truth? Just tell me, Lucy." Lucy took a deep breath. "After you became unconscious, Rose started to change. She told me she was tired of the marriage and didn't think you would survive. She stopped visiting you at the hospital and began seeing another man. I would come home from the hospital and find them in the house, sometimes even in your bed." Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. No, that's not true. Rose would never do that," he said, his voice breaking. Lucy placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard to believe, Mark, but I saw it with my own eyes. She was with him right here in this house. Then, just a few days before your surgery, something happened. I came home and found her acting strangely, talking to herself and tearing at her clothes. Before I could stop her, she ran out of the gate screaming. She lost her mind, Mark. That was the last time I saw her. Mark sat frozen, unable to process Lucy's words. Tears streamed down his face as the weight of the betrayal hit him. How could she do this to me? He whispered, his voice shaking. After everything we've been through, how could Rose leave me like this? She couldn't even wait for me to die first. Lucy leaned closer, wiping away his tears. Mark, I know it hurts, but you have to let go. You're alive, and that's what matters. Mercy needs you now more than ever. I used everything I had to make sure you got through the surgery. You have to be strong for her. Mark buried his face in his hands, sobbing quietly. I thought I knew her, he whispered. I thought she loved me. Lucy hugged him gently. Maybe she did in her own way, Mark. But right now, you need to focus on healing and moving forward. Mercy is here, and so am I. We'll get through this together. Days passed. Mark couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. Late at night, as he sat in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind raced. Should I forgive her? He wondered aloud. I miss her. She's still my wife. But what if I had died? She left me when I needed her the most. No, I can't. I have to move on. His heart was heavy with confusion, torn between love and betrayal. Meanwhile, Rose was wandering the streets, lost in her madness. Her once beautiful face was now dirty, her clothes torn. She picked trash from bins and ate scraps like an animal. Unbeknownst to everyone, Rose was pregnant with Chief's child. Her swollen belly grew day by day, but no one paid attention to the mad woman roaming the town. At home, Lucy seemed like the perfect wife and stepmother. She treated Mark with kindness, cooking his meals, ironing his clothes, and making sure Mercy felt loved. Mark was grateful for her, often thinking, Lucy has been my rock through all of this. But Lucy had her own secret intentions. She started wearing skimpy clothes around Mark, her behavior becoming flirtatious. One night, she knocked on his door with a tray of food. Mark, I made your favorite dinner, she said sweetly, placing the tray on the table. As she bent down, her short dress revealed more than it should. Mark felt uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. Slowly, Lucy's seduction worked, and they started having an affair. 6 months later, Mark proposed to Lucy. She eagerly said yes, and they had a quiet wedding. Lucy became his new wife and officially Mercy's stepmother. But as time passed, Lucy's true colors began to show. Whenever Mark was at work, Lucy turned cruel. Why are you so clumsy, Mercy? Lucy snapped one afternoon when Mercy accidentally spilled her juice. Before the little girl could apologize, Lucy slapped her hard across the face. You're just like your mad mother, she hissed. Mercy cried, holding her cheek. I want my mommy, she whispered through tears. You'll never see her again, Lucy yelled, dragging the child to her room and locking her inside. Lucy's behavior grew worse with every passing day, but she was careful to act sweet and kind whenever Mark was around.
One afternoon, Mark was driving to the market when he stopped at a traffic light. As he waited, something caught his eye. A mad woman sitting by the roadside, playing with rocks. Her belly was swollen, and her hair was a tangled mess. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. It was Rose. For a moment, he couldn't move. Memories of their happy life together flashed in his mind. Their wedding day, the birth of Mercy, the laughter they shared. He felt a mix of anger, sadness, and guilt. How did it come to this? He thought. Just then, loud car horns jolted him out of his thoughts. The light had turned green, and the cars behind him were impatient. Mark quickly drove away, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. When Mark got home, he was quiet. Lucy noticed his unease and asked, Mark, what's wrong? You look troubled. After a moment of hesitation, he said, Lucy, I saw Rose today. Lucy froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. Where did you see her? She was sitting by the roadside, looking mad, Mark said, his voice heavy with emotion. Lucy, I think I should forgive her and perform the rituals to make her sane again. At least for Mercy's sake. She deserves to have her mother back, even if Rose can't live with us anymore. Lucy's face tightened. She clenched her fists, hiding her panic. No, Mark, she said firmly. You can't bring that woman back into our lives. She left you when you needed her the most. She's dangerous. Do you really want someone like that around, Mercy? Mark looked conflicted. I don't want her back in my life, Lucy, but she's still Mercy's mother. Mercy might hate me one day if she finds out I could have helped and didn't. Lucy quickly placed her hand on his arm. Mark, listen to me. I've been like a mother to Mercy. I've taken care of her, loved her, and protected her. Bringing Rose back will only confuse Mercy and ruin the peace we've built. Please, don't do this. Mark sighed deeply. Maybe you're right, but it's not an easy decision, Lucy. Lucy smiled, hiding her relief. Trust me, Mark. It's for the best. Mark nodded, though his heart felt heavy. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Rose's face, the lost look in her eyes and the child she carried. He turned over, unsure if he had made the right choice. It was a hot afternoon in a busy market. The noise of people bargaining was suddenly replaced by a crowd gathering around a mad pregnant woman screaming in pain. Rose, the woman, was in labor. Some kind-hearted women quickly pulled out their wrappers to shield her and give her some privacy. The crowd held their breath as Rose pushed with all her strength. Finally, the baby came. But something was wrong. The baby, a little boy, didn't cry. He wasn't breathing. Rose held onto his tiny, lifeless body, rocking him and crying uncontrollably. Though she was mad, her sorrow was raw and heartbreaking. People tried to take the baby from her, but she screamed and clung to him tightly. Please, don't take my baby, she wailed. After some time, the women gently took the baby and buried him nearby. Among the onlookers was Mrs. Mary, a wealthy woman passing through the market. She couldn't get Rose's pain out of her mind. She called her driver and some men to help. They carefully carried Rose to a nearby psychiatric hospital. There, Rose was cleaned, her hair was shaved, and she was given clean clothes. The doctors started treatment, but after 8 long months, Rose showed no signs of improvement. Mrs. Mary visited Rose often, sometimes once or twice a month. During one of her visits, a doctor pulled her aside. Madam, I don't think this is just a medical case. Her condition hasn't improved at all. It could be spiritual, he said cautiously. There's a pastor I know who has helped patients recover after years of treatment. Mary frowned and shook her head. I don't believe in that. Mental health isn't spiritual. Just keep trying with the treatment, she said firmly before leaving. Meanwhile, Lucy was frustrated. She had been trying to have a baby for years, but nothing worked. Each failed attempt made her more irritable. She would shout at little things, and the once peaceful house felt tense. As time passed, her frustration grew, and it became clear to everyone around her. Rose had been in the psychiatric hospital for another year, but her condition didn't improve. Mrs. Mary, who had been caring for her, felt hopeless. The doctors tried everything, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, after more convincing from the doctors, Mrs. Mary agreed to take Rose to a well-known pastor who had helped others in similar situations. That night, the pastor and a group of prayer warriors gathered around Rose for a midnight prayer. They sang worship songs, their voices filling the room with hope. They prayed fervently, calling on God to heal Rose. Hours passed, and suddenly Rose let out a loud cry. It was as if something dark had left her body. She collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily, but when she opened her eyes, she looked different. Rose sat there, confused and scared. Where am I? What's happening? She asked. The next morning, Mrs. Mary gently explained everything, how she had found Rose, taken her to the hospital, and now to the church. Rose began to cry, thanking Mrs. Mary for saving her. She told Mrs. Mary about her husband Mark, and the sacrifices she made to save his life that led to her madness. How could you sacrifice your own life for a man? It's not worth it, Rose. Rose looked up as tears rolled down her cheeks. Then she said, Mark was not just a man. He was my life, my savior. He had sacrificed so much for me. In fact, he gave me life. I was just 16 when my whole world fell apart. That day, I came home from school and there was a crowd in front of my house. My heart started racing as I pushed through the people, asking, what's going on? Where are my parents? But no one answered me. They just stared at me with pity, which made me even more scared. I ran inside the house, calling out, Mom, Dad, I'm home. Where are you? I searched every room, but they weren't there. Before I could figure out what was happening, two women came in and sat me down. I'll never forget their words. "Rose, your parents were in a motorcycle accident and they didn't make it." My legs gave way and I dropped to the floor. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No, this can't be true. I screamed, crying so hard it felt like my chest would explode. My parents were my everything. We didn't have much, but they made sure I was happy and cared for. And now they were gone. Just like that. After the funeral, I didn't know what to do or where to go. I had no one left, just me. That's when my aunt came and took me to live with her. She and her husband didn't have much, and they couldn't afford to send me back to school. My aunt sold ground nuts by the roadside, and soon she taught me how to hawk so we could earn enough to eat. Every day, I would carry a tray of ground nuts on my head and walk around the market. It wasn't easy, but I had no choice. I needed to help my aunt. One of the shops I always visited was Mark's shop. Mark was a young man who sold phone accessories. He wasn't rich, but he always seemed so calm and kind. Whenever I brought ground nuts to his shop, he treated me with respect, just like his other customers. One day, Mark asked me, "Rose, why aren't you in school? You're so smart." His words stung because I wanted to be in school more than anything. I sat down on a small bench outside his shop and told him everything. I told him about my parents, the accident, and how my aunt couldn't afford to send me to school. As I spoke, tears rolled down my face. Mark listened quietly, and when I finished, he handed me a handkerchief and said, "I'm so sorry, Rose. You've been through a lot, but don't lose hope. Things will get better." A week later, Mark called me to his shop. I was nervous, wondering why he wanted to see me. When I got there, he smiled and said, "Rose, I've decided to help you go back to school." I couldn't believe it. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice shaking. When he nodded, I started crying, this time out of pure joy. I ran home to tell my aunt, and she was just as happy as I was. That's how my life began to change. With Mark's help, I went back to school. I still hawked ground nuts after class and during holidays to help my aunt, but now I had hope. Mark supported me every step of the way. He made sure I didn't lack anything. When I finished secondary school and got into university, he continued to stand by me. He was my rock, my one constant in life. After I graduated, Mark did something I'll never forget. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I couldn't stop crying as I said yes. We had a simple but beautiful wedding. "Now he is gone. Mark died," Rose said as Mrs. Mary held her. Rose assumed Mark must have died during his surgery since he hadn't come for her. "I need to see my daughter," Rose pleaded. Mrs. Mary held her hand and said, "You will, but first you need to rest. Let's get you strong again." Mrs. Mary took Rose to her home, bought her new clothes and even wigs to cover her shaved head. Within a week, Rose looked like herself again, perhaps even better. But her heart ached for Mercy, and she was determined to see her little girl soon. Rose felt her heart pounding as she and Mrs. Mary drove to Lucy's house. This was the moment she had been waiting for, finally reuniting with her daughter, Mercy. She held on to the hope that both Lucy and Mercy would be there. When they arrived, they knocked, but the neighbors told them Lucy had moved out. Rose's heart sank, but she wasn't giving up. "Let's go to my husband's house," she told Mrs. Mary. When they reached Mark's house, Rose took a deep breath and knocked. The door creaked open, and there stood Mercy. Her little face froze in shock for a moment before her eyes lit up. "Mama!" Mercy cried, throwing herself into Rose's arms. They both fell onto the floor in the sitting room, holding each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Their emotional reunion was interrupted when Mark and Lucy came out of the bedroom. Lucy's face turned pale, and Mark stood frozen in disbelief. Lucy quickly dropped to her knees, trembling as she began to apologize. "I'm so sorry, Rose. Mark, I was jealous. I saw how happy you both were, and I wanted it for myself," Lucy confessed, sobbing. "I lied and manipulated everything to get what I wanted. Please forgive me." Rose was stunned, but her shock deepened when she turned to Mark. "You're alive?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You left me when I needed you the most?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Lucy's loud apologies drowned him out. Mark's face turned red with fury. He stormed into the house and returned moments later holding a cutlass. "You snake!" he roared, charging at Lucy. "I'll kill you today!" Lucy screamed and ran out of the house, not daring to look back. As she dashed into the street, a speeding car came out of nowhere. It struck Lucy and she fell to the ground lifeless. Rose and Mrs. Mary ran outside, horrified, while Mark stood still, his anger replaced by shock. After Lucy's burial, Mark knelt before Rose with tears in his eyes. "Rose, I'm sorry. I've made so many mistakes. Please forgive me," he pleaded. Rose looked at him, her heart heavy but calm. "Mark, you were my first love, and I still love you," she said softly. "But I can't accept you back just like that. We'll have to take things slow and start fresh, one step at a time." Mark nodded, tears streaming down his face as he hugged her tightly. Rose felt a glimmer of hope for the future as she held on to Mercy, vowing to protect her happiness and rebuild her life.